continue our study today of an overview of the Roman emperors. Remember, what we're doing is we're trying to cover 100 years in an hour. And that's a gross disrespect to the Empire of Rome. But for our purposes, we're not necessarily looking at Roman history for the sake of studying Roman history, of course. We're looking at it from the sake of trying to understand how that fits in with the Bible. And some of what we're going to talk about tonight definitely fits in with the Bible. All of it does in an overview, but more some than others. I don't know how far we'll get. If we don't make it all the way to Domitian, that's fine. But next week we will not be looking at Roman emperors. We'll be moving on into first century culture and things like that. So we covered Augustus pretty deeply last week. So we'll begin first with his the one who follows him, the Tiberius. Tiberius is an interesting character. By the way, Augustus, I think, is one of the few, if not the only, emperors to die of natural causes and not be killed. So Tiberius takes his spot, but Tiberius is not next in line to take his spot. Augustus has two grandsons that he wants to leave the empire to, because Augustus was a sly dog. He was a very good emperor, but he did things in certain ways where, I mentioned last week that he follows kind of Julius Caesar's personality, in that he will make you think that doing the wrong thing for the right reasons is right, and so Augustus wants to establish a monarchy in Rome, and he doesn't get to do that, of course, because Rome has already had a monarchy before the Republic, and they hated it. There was a revolt and an uprising, but here's what he does get to do. He gets to become emperor. Well, that's just like being a king, is it not? So, because it's a new idea and it just seems good. So, his grandsons are next in line, but his grandsons don't get to take his spot. Instead, we get Tiberius. Tiberius is the stepson and son-in-law of Augustus. If you ever get a chance to look at Roman emperors' family trees, just go ahead and jump off a cliff. It's less painful. Studying their family trees is so difficult because everyone is intermarried. There's a lot of incestual relationships that go on. There's a lot of in-laws and outlaws who can get married and divorced and killed and all of that. But basically, Tiberius's mother was married to a guy named, heaven help me, I'm going to forget it, Germanicus. And Germanicus was one of the lead generals for Julius Caesar and Augustus. So Germanicus is married to this woman named Livia, who is Tiberius's mother. Livia is forced to divorce Germanicus because Augustus wants her to be his wife. And she does that. She doesn't want to. She loves Germanicus. But she also understands that to tell the emperor no is to basically die. So she does, and she marries Augustus. So now Tiberius, as her son, is adopted by Augustus. Tiberius has a reputation of being a troubled emperor. And the reason for that is because he grew up in a military household. He's very good at running a military. He's not good at being a politician. And he doesn't like politics, and that's going to get him in trouble a lot. That bullet point probably should have been up second instead of third about him being adopted by Augustus. But you can tell early on he was adopted by Augustus. The ancient sources are biased against Tiberius. Now, what does that mean? When you read the ancient sources, they don't put Tiberius in a very good light. 2,000 years later, when we look at Tiberius and what he did and what he accomplished, he wasn't a bad emperor. He wasn't a great emperor, but when you look at John Adams versus George Washington, John Adams wasn't a bad president, but he wasn't a great president either. Now, why is that? Because he followed the number one, right? He followed the standard. Being second in line for something will never put you on the same pedestal as being first. So Augustus is the first emperor. Tiberius follows. Not bad, not great. George Washington, first president. John Adams follows. Not bad, not great. So when you read the ancient sources, because everyone loved Augustus so much, Tiberius isn't going to be put on that same pedestal. And so we need to remember, if we're ever doing research about this, because Tiberius is the emperor under whom Jesus dies. And so if we're ever doing research about him, we need to remember that if we get the chance to read the ancient sources, that they do have that bias toward him. One thing that he does that is good is he gives power back to the Senate. Remember, Augustus sought to take power from the Senate because he wanted that monarchy, he wanted that power. Well, Tiberius hates politics. So if you're going to be a politician who hates politics, what do? You give the power to somebody else. So that's what Tiberius does. Now, looking at it from a distance, that seems to be a good thing because Augustus and Julius Caesar had taken power from the Senate. Tiberius reinstates it. However, for other emperors, that's going to prove to be a problem. Tiberius, as we mentioned several times, does not like being a politician nor the responsibilities that come with being a politician. He's a great military leader, but he doesn't take care of his military. So you might recall from last week when we talked about Augustus, one reason the military loved him so much was because he paid them out of his own pocket. Right? He fed them and paid them out of his own pocket. Well, when Tiberius gets in power, he neglects to do this. And by this time, he doesn't have to pay them out of his own pocket because Rome has been established back to its great glory. There's money in the bank, if you will. But he neglects to do that, and that's going to cause the armies in Pannonia and Germania to revolt. Why is that so important? Because Augustus had tried to expand the empire into Germania. When Tiberius comes on board, that's his military goal, is to expand the empire into Germania. Well, guess what? When your army revolts against you at that site, that just is the recipe for disaster. Right? So they never go into Germania while Tiberius is emperor, and he doesn't have good control of his army at this point. He will get better control of his army, but not necessarily at this point. Because Tiberius hates politics, he takes long campaigns and long vacations away from Rome. Rarely do you find him in Rome. And one thing that we're going to contrast with Tiberius and his follower, his successor, Caligula, is that Caligula spent a lot of time in Rome and the people loved him for it because they had an emperor who didn't spend a whole lot of time in Rome. I mean, think about it. You have the President of the United States. He spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C. That's where he lives. That's where he works. That's what he does. But even in our own history, perhaps recent history, think about when Donald Trump got put in the hospital. Well, he wasn't deathly ill with COVID-19, right? I mean, he was sick, but he wasn't deathly ill. The doctors were very sure that he was going to be okay, and there are even pictures of him working at the hospital. And I don't care what your political affiliation is. This is not a political comment. I'm just making the point that when he leaves the White House, everyone panicked because the president wasn't in the White House. Well, imagine that in ancient Rome with Tiberius, who never spends any time in Rome. How do you govern an empire from not being in the capital? Right? And so this is going on right during the ministry of Jesus. Will lead up to the crucifixion of Jesus, and that's what's going on in the backdrop of the Roman Empire. Okay, let's skip that next point because we've talked about it 1,000 times. He was eventually murdered by his nephew Caligula. When Caligula's father dies, is murdered, Caligula comes back to Rome. His entire family is captured and put in jail for conspiracy. By the way, that's another important thing that I need to know about Tiberius. Tiberius made it law where anyone who said anything bad about him, anyone he knew, or the Roman Empire, anything bad at all, could be tried for treason and executed. So if I was walking through the streets of Rome one day and I said, you know what, that building that was built in honor to Tiberius has a corner that's off, I could be put on trial for treason and killed. So Tiberius had his issues, but as I said, he's ultimately murdered by Caligula. So there's a picture of Tiberius, his bust, very Julius Caesar-like, isn't it? Caligula then takes over. He reigns from 37 AD to 41 AD. Caligula is well known because he is an absolute nutcase. And most Roman emperors are going to either be really good or absolute nutcases. There is no in between for the Roman emperors. His actual given name is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Caligula is not a name. It is a nickname. Caligula means little boots. And the reason he got that nickname is because his father was a Roman general, and he would travel around with his father, and he basically grew up in military camps. And so the soldiers gave him this nickname, Little Boots, and it just stuck, and that's what we know him as today. Caligula is basically in every aspect incompetent to rule. The only reason he gets to rule rather than the person who was next in line, which if memory serves me right, was Tiberius's son, is that Tiberius's son is approximately 8 years old when Tiberius dies, and they need someone older, and so you get Caligula, who's his nephew. Caligula has severe mental illness. When you read the historians and they describe certain things about him, it's very much in line with depression and bipolar disorder. At times you might even read a little schizophrenia in there. I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, I don't play one on TV, but that's what you get when you read them. And now modern scholars suggest that he certainly had those things. He also had terrible bouts of sickness. He would get what they call brain fevers, and he would start convulsing and pass out, and he would be passed out in a coma for several days, and then he'd come back and wouldn't remember anything, and he'd be fine, but that's just what would happen. Well, you have those, and in combination with the family tree that doesn't fork, we know now from psychology that these mental illnesses pass down through genetics. So combination of the two, it's just a perfect storm for Caligula to have these mental illnesses. He's not competent to rule, not at all. He has no idea what it means to have power. So what happens when you give, and he's approximately 24 years old when he takes the throne. What happens when you give a 24-year-old absolute power? Nothing good, right? Caligula is known for being the emperor of the people. And I say here to note Tiberius, and that's because Tiberius is always gone, right? Tiberius is always away from Rome. He has no association with the people. Caligula is the exact opposite extreme. Caligula wanted the people to be on his side, and so he would have all these expensive and expansive parties, and he would invite all the common people to come. He would spend his time walking out in the streets of Rome, and people would shout at him and wave and throw things and all that stuff, and they just loved seeing the emperor. It reminds me, again, I know I'm pulling a lot of American history into this, but it reminds me of when JFK was elected president. JFK was a young guy, right? And I think, too, that's why now people like AOC, Omar, who are the others? Dan Crenshaw, some of the younger people are getting such good footing in politics now is because we have this false notion that young equals fresh and new, and that fresh and new equals utopia, and that's not true. You know, fresh and new usually means the exact opposite. But that's why they have this traction. Well, when JFK was elected president, everyone loved him, because he's a young guy, he's charismatic, and he's always out, he's with the people, he rides in a convertible, and ultimately that didn't work out well for him, did it? But Caligula, the same way. He's always out with the people. But as Caligula grows, he actually starts out as a great emperor. He loves his job, and he cares about people. And that's a great thing for a leader, especially of people, to do. You have to care about people, and he does. But eventually, his delusions of grandeur is going to cost him to spend a lot of money that he doesn't have. And so how do you get that money back? Well, you kill people, and you take their stuff. And so anyone who spoke out against him, he killed, he executed thousands of people. He marries his own sister. This is not a stepsister. This is a real, true sister. And to be completely honest with you, his sister instigates the relationship because she wants power. She wants to be the queen, and at whatever cost. Caligula is the first emperor who demands to be worshipped as a god. Now, we mentioned Augustus deifying Julius Caesar and becoming deified himself. But we have to make this difference in our mind that Augustus never saw himself as a god. When Julius Caesar dies, he believes Julius Caesar became a god, and that as such he is the son of a god. But he never sees himself as God himself. Caligula does. Caligula, as a god, attempts to install a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. Now think about this. Caligula is not the only emperor who's going to try to put a statue of himself up in Jerusalem. Many emperors are going to try to do that because it's the center of worship, right? And when you go there, you need a reminder of really who is God, and they're going to put their statue up. We can talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly about the Jews of the first century. One thing that I always admire about the Jews of the first century is their willingness to be solely devoted to Yahweh. You're not going to bring that image in the temple because the temple is sacred space. And I think for the emperors, they're probably sitting there thinking, oh, it's just, you're a Roman province, this is the Roman emperor, it's not a worship thing. We just want to put this beautiful statue of so-and-so up. And the Jews would not have it. So much so that there are so many Jewish revolts during the first century. We don't read about them in Scripture a lot, but there's so many Jewish revolts in the first century that most of the emperors take their statues and leave. And I often wonder how our world would be different if Christians would adopt that same idea. We're not going to worship so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so. Ultimately, Caligula is assassinated by the Senate and the Praetorians. We read about the Praetorian Guard all throughout Scripture, right? The Praetorian Guard is the secret service of the emperor. And I do sympathize with Caligula because how terrible is it to have your most trusted people turn on you, ultimately kill you? That's not fun at all. There's a picture of Caligula. Pretty good looking guy, very young guy, and very different from the man who follows him. When you think about Caligula, you think about someone who's young and energetic, right? When you think about someone like Claudius, again, I'm not trying to be political, but Claudius reminds me a lot of Joe Biden. Because, well, let me say this. The ancient sources on Claudius remind me a lot about Joe Biden. Because Claudius is this absent-minded, just ignorant, doesn't look like a leader. And I'm, again, not trying to be political, but just the overall stereotype of both kind of reminds me of that. In actuality, Claudius is a really good emperor. Claudius is probably the best emperor that Rome ever has, even though the sources are biased against him. His name is Tiberius Claudius Drusus, and then he changes his names to Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus. He is the brother of Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, and the uncle of Caligula. So if you're making your family tree, he is the nephew of Tiberius, uncle of Caligula. Basically, Claudius is in the background, both in the reign of Tiberius and in the reign of Caligula. Now that's important for us to know, because what do we know about history? Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. One of the reasons why Claudius is one of the greatest emperors in Rome is because he was a student of ancient history. And he understood that if he wanted to not make the mistakes that everyone else made, he needed to know what they did and why they did it. So why do the sources make Claudius to be this kind of absent-minded Joe Biden of a guy? He was a very sick child. He had a speech impediment, he had a limp, and he kind of had this hunched over, if you've seen the Hunchback of Notre Dame Disney movie, that's kind of how he's portrayed. He has these physical abnormalities. And imagine being an emperor in Rome and having to give speeches and having to be a military leader. I mean, all the guys that we've seen before, they just have this chiseled jawbone and they just have these eyes for conquest, right? They're just these masculine, manly men. And Claudius is not at all. And it's not his fault. It's just the way he is. He is, however, the most academic of the first century emperors. That's important because, for two reasons. Number one, academia is not at all a value in first century Rome. It is to some degree on the Jewish circles and in the Greek circles, but not in the Roman circles. Romans are all about masculinity and power and conquest, and Claudius is about books and learning. He does, because he is an academic, conquer Britannica, which is something that has not been accomplished by the Romans yet. How was he able to do that? Well, every other Roman emperor had tried and failed. Well, instead of trying and failing again, why don't you ask the fundamental question, why did this fail? And not do that. And that's exactly what he does. Claudius is mentioned in the Bible. In Acts chapter 18, which y'all are going through the book of Acts after this, and so in Acts chapter 18, Claudius gives an edict to expel the Jews from Rome. There are two Jewish diasporas that are mentioned in the Bible. The first is when the Jews go from exile in the book of Daniel and others, going in captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon and Persia and Assyria. And when they get told they can return home, some of them don't, and they start their spreading then. But then you have the second diaspora, which is where the Jews are expelled from Rome. He, again, incestual relationships and weird stuff going on here. He marries his niece, Agrippina. Agrippina is the single most ambitious woman in Roman history, and maybe the single most ambitious woman in world history. Agrippina does not give two cares what you think of her or what she has to do to get power. And remember our 4 words that we remember with the Roman Empire. Romans don't share power. So Agrippina does not like sharing power. She marries Claudius so she can get power. And then it's believed that she assassinates Claudius. That's not proven. We don't know that for sure. But any historian who says otherwise probably got their degree from a Cracker Jack box. So, I mean, it's just glaring in the face, even though we don't have any source material that point blank says it. Remember, Agrippina has a son named Nero. And one of the reasons why she kills Claudius is so her son Nero can take the throne. Now remember, we compared, well, let's go back to Caligula. So here's Caligula's picture. Get that image in your mind. That's the picture of a Roman emperor. Now Caligula was an ever-loving nut, and we know that, but that's what an emperor looks like. There's what Claudius looks like. Do you see the difference? He's got a good double chin going on, very sunken facial features, kind of a stoic perspective here. So it's important for us to realize, and again, I'm not an artist or an art evaluator or anything like that, but when we look at ancient depictions, the minute details say things about how that world viewed these people. I can almost promise you Julius Caesar, Caligula, Augustus, they didn't look like their sculptures. So here's how Claudius is portrayed. When we think about emperors who are significant for biblical studies, I think 3 really jump out at us. Well, maybe 4 if we count the Edict of Claudius, but 3 in particular. The first is Augustus, the second is Nero, and the third is Domitian. Depending on how you date the book of Revelation, and this is not a class on the dating of the book of Revelation, but you could argue that the persecution that's taking place there is either the persecution of Nero or the persecution of Domitian. Nero is at the forefront of our minds when we study the Bible because he is the one under whom most all the apostles will die, with the exception of John. So Nero, kind of like Caligula, began his rule as a great emperor. But Nero never saw himself as a politician or as an emperor. Nero saw himself as an artist. He believed that he was born to be an actor. Now, the humor of that probably passes on us because today, being an actor, if you can be a successful actor, that's actually very valued in our society. The Roman society, acting was along the lines of philosophy. It was for the people who had nothing else better to do. And going to watch plays and being a playwright and playing music and all of that was just absolutely worthless. It was the lowest of the low as far as professions. But Nero, I'll give you something funny. When Nero dies, Nero commits suicide, spoiler alert, and when he dies, his last words we're told in ancient sources are, "What an artist dies in me." Those are his last words. What a nut. So Nero began really, really good as an emperor because he was taught by Seneca. Seneca is a philosopher, statesman, and dramatist. Seneca is a very good Stoic philosopher. Very good, very smart. He's able to take instances and break them down and be really objective about them. And so when Nero gets put in the emperorship, who's his right-hand man? Well, his right-hand man is Seneca. Well, guess what? His mother, Agrippina, sees this, and she starts inserting herself as his great advisor. And so he no longer listens to Seneca, but now listens to Agrippina. Claudius wished Nero and his other son, Britannicus, would share the power. So before Claudius is murdered, he institutes for Nero and Britannicus to co-rule. Remember our 4 words. And these are brought out very evidently here because Nero has Britannicus killed. We mentioned Nero being a good emperor because he followed the advice of Seneca, but then he turns his attention to his mother. Nero is the definition of a mama's boy. And I'm not saying that to be anything bad, but I mean, he cannot do anything without his mother there. It's like she is you've heard the term helicopter parent. Well, her helicopter never gets off the ground. She is always there ruling behind Nero. There are some who disagree with this, but I believe that Nero is the definition of a puppet emperor. He just does whatever his mama tells him to do. And you can see his love for her and his devotion to her by the use of the Praetorian password. In other words, if you want access to the emperor, you have to go through the Praetorian Guard. You have to know the secret password. And the password was Optima Mater, which means optimal mother or the best mother. Well, who's that in reference to? It's in reference to Agrippina. Well, you notice the next bullet point. This is something that we may not think based on what I've said about Nero and Agrippina thus far, but Nero does kill his mother in 59 AD. Why does he do that? Because he knows that his mother is trying to take his power. Nero develops paranoia, and that's something very common with the emperors. They feel like everyone's out to get them, that everyone wants to kill them. And why is that? Well, it's because people are killing each other all the time for power. And they know that. And secrets can't be held. Right? So Nero gets his paranoia. He believes that his mother is going to kill him. And so he beats her to the punch. Interestingly, Nero tries to kill his mother 3 different times in 3 different ways. And Nero's artistry, I think, is seen with these 3 different ways. The first time, he sends the Praetorian Guard in to stab her to death. She hears about it and leaves for a while and then ultimately comes back. I think the most creative way he tries to kill her is he puts her on a ship and tells her that she has a mission to go off as an ambassador somewhere, and then the ship blows up in the middle of the ocean and the ship sinks, and his hope is that she will drown and it'll just be because of the ship sinking, right? Well, Agrippina gets out and just swims back to shore. And so ultimately, I think ultimately she is stabbed in order to, by way of her killing. When we think about Nero in the Bible, the persecution of Nero obviously is going to come up. If you've watched a History Channel documentary on Nero, I want to encourage you to just ignore 90% of what they say. Because, well, obviously, if you're doing something for the History Channel, it has to be dramatized, right? I mean, everything has to be over the top. Even your interviews with your great historians and your professors and all that, it just has to be over the top. So just ignore like 90% of that. You may have heard that in Nero's persecution, he lit people on fire and hung them as street lamps for Rome. I don't know if you've heard that or not. It's a very popular thing. There's 99.9% chance that never happened. Nero is famous for having fed Christians to the lions. That probably happened because you have the Colosseum, and that's what happened in the Colosseum. Christians probably fought each other in the gladiatorial games and things like that, but the persecution of Nero begins with the Great Fire of Rome. Most every historian believes that Nero started this fire in AD 64. There's no proof of that, but based on what Nero does as a result of the fire makes you believe that Nero started the fire, or had the fire started, or was the mastermind behind it. Nero blames the Christians because of their hatred of the human race. And all of this area of Rome that's destroyed by the fire, he claims for himself. Now, if Nero had not started the fire, and had Nero been a good emperor, what would you do? You would rebuild, and you would, reestablish that area for the city. But he doesn't. He builds his Domus Aurea, which is basically a home away from home. Another palace for Nero. Nero is often referred to as the first persecutor of Christians. When we talk about the persecution of Nero, we need to remember that Nero, the evidence that we have historically suggests that Nero only persecuted Christians that are in Rome. So when we think about Christian persecution in places like Philippi, Colossae, Corinth, these are Roman provinces, but they're not Rome. Now what Nero does, and what other emperors will do, is they'll allow their governors who are over these provinces the ability to persecute Christians. But as far as Nero's persecution, his persecution doesn't go outside the city of Rome. Let's see. Okay, very good. I do think when we talk about Christian persecution, because when we come to the book of Revelation, if you date the book of Revelation to the persecution of Nero, which I think is dating it a little early, but regardless, if you date it to the persecution of Nero, we often talk about just how terrible that persecution was And it was. I'm not trying to make light of that. But we give the Romans such a hard time about being the first persecutors of the Christians. The Romans were not the first persecutors of the Christians. The Jews were. When you read about the Apostle Paul, what does he call himself? He says, I persecuted the church. Those are his words. And Paul was a Jew. So the Jews are the first persecutors of Christians, not the Romans. That's important for us to understand. There's the bust of Nero. Again, every time I see this bust, I point this out because it's just not how you would view a Roman emperor. His little chin strap beard here, how disgusting. Emperors did not have facial hair, at least not until Hadrian, and that's going to be long time from now. This shows us that he viewed himself as more of a scholar and a poet, a philosopher and an artist, and we've mentioned that here. He saw that as his grand purpose in life, and I'm trying to think of a way that I can bring that into our own cultural context. Imagine having a president who believes his sole purpose in life is, I'm trying to think of a very lowly job without being politically incorrect. But okay, I'll take one from my own context. From being a professional pooper scooper in a horse barn. You know, I mean, that would just be weird for the President of the United States to wake up every day and say, where's my shovel? I have to go clean horse stalls. That's kind of how Nero was. And the coins here too, Nero, these coins are so weird because this is Nero and his mom. It's not a husband and wife duo. And even on coins, you don't have two people. Right? Even on American coins, we don't have two people. But Nero does. And this is the same coin front and back. The front says, Agrippina Augusta, wife of the divine Claudius, mother of Nero Caesar. So who is on the front being given all the glory and praise? It ain't Nero. It's his mama. And then on the back, and by the way, Latin writes an abbreviation, so that's a lot to put on this coin. But then on the back it says, by decree of the Senate, Nero, son of the divine Claudius, Augustus Caesar Germanicus, emperor with, what does that say? With tribunican power. So just, there's no question when you get these coins who's in power. Coins are propaganda in the first century. Well, from 68 to 69, there's 1 year, and you have the year of the four emperors. 4 emperors in 1 year. We will not talk about any of these except for Vespasian. You start with Galba, who reigns from June of 68 to January of 69. And then from January to April, you have Otho. From April to December, you have Vitellius. And from December of 69 to AD 79, so for 10 years, you have Vespasian. Vespasian is an interesting emperor because he defies all odds. He's not from a senatorial family. His father was a tax farmer and his mother was an equestrian. Equestrian is a term that's used to describe those higher up, kind of upper middle class or lower upper class, if you want to think about it there. Equestrian refers to horses, right? Equine horses. If you were rich enough to own your own horse, you were an equestrian. It's kind of like at the turn of the century, if you were rich enough to own your own car. Okay? In Egypt, Vespasian was said to have healed blindness by spitting on the eyes and lameness by touching the leg. That sound familiar? Sounds a lot like what Jesus does. Vespasian is beloved because of his ability to work miracles, or supposedly work miracles. By the time Vespasian is getting in power, though, the ministry of Jesus, I won't go so far as to say the Gospels have been written yet, but the ministry of Jesus has long circulated. And it's reached Rome, because this is past the time of Paul's missionary journey, and around the time, well, Paul probably died under Nero, but Paul has perhaps just died. And so the stories of this guy named Jesus, and by the way, there are other people in the ancient world, or in the ancient first century, besides Jesus, who claim to have done the same miracles Jesus claims to have done. Most of those come from a Jewish background. But this is kind of interesting for him to have come from a Roman background, claiming to do these things. Vespasian proves to be a good emperor. He earns the favor of the Senate and the public. If you're going to be a good emperor, you need to do that. What we find with Caligula, going back to him, he finds good favor with the public. That's great, but he does not have any favor at all with the Senate. They wind up killing him. You go to Tiberius. He has great favor with the Senate because he restored their power. Has no favor with the public. So you have to have a balance. Vespasian then has that balance, and it proves good for him. Vespasian is why we have a Colosseum. He finances the Colosseum, but the Colosseum is not finished during his lifetime, unfortunately. His son will take over that and finish the Colosseum. He is the first emperor to be succeeded by a biological child, and his biological child's name is Titus. Titus is also going to prove important for early Christianity and first century Judaism. There's a picture of Vespasian, elderly guy. So we think of what a stereotypical emperor would look like. His son Titus takes over after him. He reigns from 79 AD to 81 AD. He was assigned command of a legion in Judea prior to his coming to the emperorship. So he has a lot of ties to Judea. Titus completes the Colosseum, as we mentioned. Usually when a monument is built, it's built with a purpose. It's built with the need to honor someone or be dedicated to someone. And we're not entirely sure what he does. I think he does it as a war monument financed by his conquest of Judea. You may have, I don't think I have this on here. I don't. You may have heard the story of an emperor who sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. Titus is the emperor who does that. Remember, Jerusalem falls in AD 70 under Vespasian. Right? You remember the prophecies that Jesus told about the coming fall of Jerusalem. And one of the ways that we know how to date things like Paul's letters and the works of the New Testament is whether or not they talk about the fall of Jerusalem or not. Well, Vespasian conquers Jerusalem. Titus is assigned legion in Judea, and he is going to sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple before the temple is... Well, no, I'm sorry. I guess that's not Titus then. That has to be Vespasian. Well, regardless, Titus is a very good son because he executes many of his father's enemies, and he vowed never to kill another senator after he takes the throne. Remember, if you're an emperor in Rome, you're constantly at odds with senators, and senators are always trying to plot to kill you because you're taking power from them. And so what do? You beat them to the punch and you kill them first. Well, Titus vows to never kill another senator. That gains him favor with the Senate, of course. Titus is an unusually kind emperor. He's quoted as saying, "The day has been wasted because I have shown kindness to no one today." That's the kind of emperor I'd like to have. Someone who always wants to be nice to people. But not everyone was nice to him. Titus has a younger brother named Domitian. It's rumored that Domitian poisons Titus, which causes him to die. Again, these instances of poisoning and assassinations and all of that, we can be fairly certain who instigated it, but we can't be 100% certain. So Titus dies from being poisoned. There's Titus. Domitian is the last one that we'll talk about. He reigns from 81 to 96, so they're at the end of the first century. This is around the time that John is exiled to the island of Patmos and writes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the Gospel of John, Revelation, the Johannine literature. Domitian resents his father and brother because of the lack of love and affection that was given to him. So think about it. You have a father who's an emperor, everybody loves him. You got a brother who's emperor, everybody loves him. Then you're left in the dust. Well, he has such a hatred for his father and brother, that's going to make him and mold him into the type of emperor that he was. Unfortunately, Domitian was denied many honors that he deserved. Instead, these honors were given to Titus. I don't know if you're familiar with Norse mythology. Probably not, but maybe you're familiar with the Marvel universe, the action superhero Marvel. If you've seen the movie Thor, then you know about Thor and Loki. Well, Thor and Loki are Norse gods. And if you are familiar with Norse mythology, Thor is kind of this empty-headed, but really powerful, good-looking god, the god of thunder and lightning. And Loki is his brother. He's an adopted brother, but he is a brother. And he's the trickster god. He's the god of mischief, and he causes all kinds of problems. And Thor gets all the glory, and Loki gets all the abuse. Maybe a bad illustration for us, but that's how Domitian and Titus were. So, as a result of Domitian not getting the honor he deserves and not getting the experience that he needed growing up in an imperial household, he has little political experience. When he becomes emperor, he wants everybody and their mama to know it. So he has statues erected of himself and placed everywhere. He puts his statues everywhere. I can't stress that enough. Some ancient historians go so far as to say you could not turn on a street corner without seeing 3 statues of Domitian. No question who the emperor is. Now, a lot of people place the persecution of Revelation with the reign of Domitian. Some do it with Nero. I have no opinion on the matter. Well, I do, but I'm not going to share it. Regardless of what you do with that, we have to understand that Rome is the enemy in Revelation, and that the emperor is the leader of that enemy, right? So if you place it, Domitian here, understanding his disillusion of himself helps us understand Revelation. Domitian, like every other emperor, becomes paranoid of assassination. He's scared to death he's going to be assassinated. He does quite a lot for religious restoration in Rome, because up until that time the emperor had been the religion of Rome, right? You worship the emperor. Well, Domitian emphasizes the worship of Jupiter, who is the god of light in the sky, and also a state god, protector of the state and the laws, and of Minerva, who is the goddess of poetry, medicine, wisdom. Basically, this is the Roman version of Zeus and Athena. Okay? But Domitian, even though he emphasizes this worship, he accepts worship as deity. Now, we've seen that with other emperors, but not necessarily to the degree that Domitian does. It's under Domitian's reign where emperor worship really takes hold, and where Christians begin to be persecuted for not falling to emperor worship. There's a picture of Domitian. So to conclude, we'll just ask a simple question: why does this matter? I've taught this class to churches, I've taught it to youth groups, I've taught it to other schools, and I do think that asking the question why it matters is an important question to ask, because it seems, and I think you get this too when you watch your History Channel documentaries and whatever you want to watch, that there is a dissociation between the broad umbrella of Roman government and the small speck of the New Testament. So why does it matter? Well, for one, Here are the emperors that are mentioned in the Bible. Augustus is mentioned in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. Tiberius is mentioned in Luke 3:1 and John 19:12. Claudius is mentioned in Acts 11, 17, and 18. Nero is Acts 25, 26, and Philippians 4. This is not necessarily that they're mentioned, but this is the time frame where they would be ruling. And then depending on how you view, as we've said, 1st, 2nd Peter, Jude, and Revelation, you have Nero or Domitian. And understanding what they're doing and why they're doing it, and what Rome looked like. And when I say Rome, I don't mean just the city. I mean the empire as a whole. What that looked like during the lifetime of Jesus, during the lifetime of Paul. Again, it can't be stressed enough. Why did Jesus come when he did? Why did Paul, or how was Paul able to be a missionary in the way that he was? You know, when Paul appeals to Rome as a Roman citizen, understanding who's in power at that time, Paul is going to give his testimony before Nero. Let's not forget that when Paul writes Philippians, he says that everyone in the Praetorian Guard knows about the gospel now. So, understanding the backdrop, as we've mentioned several times, is just so very important for our understanding of the Bible. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to give a sermon on who the emperors were, but I think for our study, as we look at the New Testament, my favorite word talking about historical settings, it illuminates the text.